Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Okay, we are back here on Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism with Mick Mulroy and myself, Adam Piercy. We're here to talk about Stoicism and applying it to modern life. And in modern life, this last little bit of time, there's been a lot of dialogue around the idea of freedom of speech. Now, Mick, you and I both come from Western nations. I'm Canadian, you're American. And freedom of speech in many ways is something I don't know if I'd say we take for granted, but we'd say it's quite deeply ingrained in the fabric of our societies, both in the Constitution of Canada as well as in the Constitution of the United States, of course. So, but right now it feels a little bit like freedom of speech is under, I don't want to say under siege because that sounds like it's a war, but I think there's been some recent steps taken that have made it seem like freedom of speech is on precarious footing. We talked a little bit beforehand about some stuff you wanted to walk us through with at the beginning. So I think I'm just going to stop talking and give you the floor to introduce our subject a little bit more today.
Yeah, and freedom of speech is something we can't take for granted, but we kind of should be able to do it, right? Because it's ingrained in my constitution or the Constitution of the United States. It's ingrained in many declarations of human rights around the world. It's ingrained in many conventions of United Nations, and it's something that's absolutely paramount to a free society and democracy. I am about to head tomorrow from where I am in Montana to New York City for UNGA, where I'll be there for a bunch of uh, General Assembly, for those that aren't familiar with it, every year. And I start with that because I wanted to read some stats that I looked up and validated. Because this isn't just about this show certainly isn't just about the U.S. and Canada or our specific issues. So over the past decade, according to this, speech rights have been eroding in many countries. According to one study, 5.6 billion people, and there's 8.2 billion people, I believe, in 77 countries have seen declines in freedom of expression. Only about 300 million in 15 countries saw freedom of speech improve. So more than half of the world's population, 53%, now live in countries where freedom of expression and information are in what's called by this group that follows it a crisis. So, and as this is Stoicism and how it applies to issues, I think it's clear to me that Stoicism, in many of its facets, certainly wisdom, right? You can't actually learn things without an open discussion. For example, uh, really emphasizes the basic core need for people to be able to speak and be heard, not to be told they're right, um, in a democratic society where people are supposed to be participatory in their government, which is what a democracy is. So I'd like to start with one quote. It's Epictetus's Discourses uh, 2.17. How do we discover the truth? By dialogue, by testing each impression, by reasoning together, right? So freedom of expression requires that you do that, and therefore it should be part of any society. And we're seeing this in several factors, right? We're seeing it, just to highlight on both sides, a lot of groups on the right complain about laws that are being passed in Europe that are specifically about social media and what you can and can't post. Going beyond, you can't just post to go do violent things because that's obviously not protected speech, in my understanding. And I do have a law degree, by the way, and I did teach constitutional law. I'm not saying I'm a scholar, but my understanding, everywhere around the world, If you're trying to talk somebody into or calling for violence against a person, that's not protected speech. But you can have obnoxious views. You can have views that are really appalling. Um, in fact, that's what freedom of speech is supposed to protect, because you don't need to protect popular speech.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right? You don't need the protection. So there are groups, many groups on the right that think, and especially when it comes to immigration and the issues that are going on in these countries, that the government, the liberal government, is using their ability to curtail their speech. Here recently, there are questions in the United States about actually yanking networks licenses, because this is kind of a leftover from times gone past, where the government actually had to give you a license to be on the air.
Yeah.
Yanking the license specifically because the perception that their newscasts are not positive toward elected officials, which is the most important speech to protect. Like, when you can't criticize those that have power,
Yeah.
then you are really in what the group that studied this worldwide call a crisis. And this, just like the trend in autocracies versus democracies is going in the right direction, as one would guess, so is freedom of speech. Because you can't exist in an autocracy where everybody has a freedom of speech, at least not for long. That's the first thing any totalitarian driven leadership would try to curtail, is your ability to criticize them. So it's a very big problem. And that's how I see the problem. It's existing on both sides, and something that people need to start talking back against. And the last point before we get into the application of Stoicism, I'd say, is if you consider yourself a proponent of freedom of speech, you can't just be outraged about the speech that's being curtailed on your side or you. You have to be an advocate for anybody's ability to say what they would like without the government interfering. Yes, people can not buy your product if they don't like you. That's certainly, but the government is the issue here. And you have to be willing, I think, certainly to be a good Stoic, but just a good participant in democracy, willing to stand up for the other person's ability to speak, even if it's counter to your position, even if you find it obnoxious, right?
Yeah.
If you don't, then you're really not a proponent of free speech. You're just a person who wants your views to be heard, and you only get outraged when they're curtailed.
Absolutely. And I mean, it is one of those sort of common mindsets that you're protecting everyone else's right to do this because you're also protecting your own, right? It is a simple fact of being a citizen in a society that you have to make sure that you are resolving yourself to the vigilance you must carry out, regardless of whether it benefits you or not sometimes, right, in that moment. Because at some point it may be the one thing that you rely on. I should say in the constitutional monarchy that is Canada, right, in the parliamentary activities that happen, our parliament returned to Parliament Hill this week, basically, and we have something called question period, which is literally where two people face off, at least at a minimum, which is the leaders are questioned by the House of Commons, where all of the elected politicians are, right? And
it's like the Brits. That's probably
we have a parliamentary build up like that. So yes, you're right. It's like the Brits, and so we did question period this past week. It was interesting because the news plays it up like it's two titans throwing barbs, right? And you're like, well, yeah, but it's like it's two politicians, like they're nerds, right? It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is that like it is literally like you have the government and you have the opposition, right? You have and they are literally opposed to each other on a lot of these views. And that's a core part of how this works. I mean, even I know, like, I went to an American International High School when I was in the UK, so I know a little bit more about the US government process and the parliamentary actions they take there. Bills go through debate, they go through committees, they get talked about all over the place, right? And if we don't have this freedom to disagree, We lose, I think, objectivity, but also I think we lose the verification of things being correct. And I think that's where we're probably going to talk about it as we go forward. But I think if we don't have that discussion, we are worse off. But we do have to protect it. I think that's a key thing that you're talking about. And the Stoics would always say, like, you're protecting it because, like, you're protecting it for it's. Well, if I were to just straight up quote Marcus and say what's good for the hive is good for the bee, like, it is good for the hive to check and balance these things with freedom of speech and freedom to disagree. And so, having only one viewpoint has never worked for anybody. So let's not go down that path, right? And I think
Right.
that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, and
So,
a close attached right to freedom of speech is freedom of the press, right? Because
mhm.
the press has to have the ability to report the news as they see it. And I would agree with, I think, everybody now that sees political bias in a lot of the reporting on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Um, but they have a right to be that, you know? And
Hmm.
if you are a person who likes MSNBC, well, let's use US MSNBC, you should be okay with people and want to ensure that Fox News also has the right to deliver the news the way they want to, and vice versa,
Yeah.
right? And the reason why it's so closely attached is the whole job of the media is to expose the truth and to report it and to hold those in power accountable. That is why they are so closely tied to freedom of speech and why it's so important that they have the ability, without government interference, um, to carry on without fear of reprisal. Now, the whole cancel culture, that's another part of this. I'm not a supporter of the cancel culture, at least the way I understand it. But you have a right, if you don't like what the CEO of a company said, um, not to purchase that person's product anymore, even though that it has nothing to do with his political or her political views. But that's fine because you're a citizen. You're not the government, right?
Right.
So you can do that. That's, I mean, I don't, but people can, of course. But that's, again, when it comes to the constitutional form of freedom of speech, and I think in every country that has it, it's focused on the government's ability, right? Like in
Right.
the United States, we have a constitution that enumerates the powers of the federal government. And then the 10th Amendment says anything that's not enumerated to the federal government is left to the states. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights, which is the first part of the amendments, is all about what the government can't do to people, right? Because people had lived in a monarchy that could do whatever it wanted until they broke free. So
Yeah.
they spent a lot of time. And that's, even the Second Amendment, right? We're not talking about guns today, but even the Second Amendment was about the citizens' ability to have some kind of counterbalance to the government itself, right? It's really not about hunting, for example. It's about having the ability to defend yourself as a group. Uh, the ability to speak your mind is mostly focused on the ability to speak truth to power,
Yes.
and the limitations are about their ability to make you stop. Okay,
Yeah.
so I would hope that everybody doesn't just say, because everybody says, "Yeah, of course I believe in freedom of speech." Because just to be frank, you sound like a moron if you don't. But you actually have to do it, and what I mean do it is you have to defend everybody's. So if you're
Yeah.
if you're okay with the government coming after your political enemies, you are not for freedom of speech. If
Right.
you're no matter what side you are, it has to be more than just, of course, I like apple pie and I like freedom of speech. That's what I mean by you'd be a moron if you didn't agree to. It's
Yeah.
just, it can't just be a throwaway um, tagline. If it erodes entirely. It is happening in other places of the world. So those of you who are lucky enough to live in modern democracies need to see that. Hopefully, help the people push back against it in other places, but realize that this freedom is not necessarily permanent for you. You have to defend your own rights and the rights of others. And I think is Stoic opposition, right? So that's a great example we can use, um, through the tyranny of many, Roman emperors, Nero, for example, and you could go down the list, where Stoics, although it wasn't like a political movement necessarily, right? We
No,
call it that
no.
now, but it was
Right.
Stoics that were willing to stand up to the tyranny based on Stoic principles, right? That's why they were aligned. Some of whom, were exiled, some of whom were executed because there was no freedom of speech back then. But they insisted on still speaking their mind and talking truth to power.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Stoic opposition is a good one to bring up because this is not the first time we've had people make a stand against the acts of people that are definitely not, they're definitely pushing the boundaries of, legality for both human rights or, just government civil rights, right? And the Stoic opposition, it's interesting because it's not a term they used in the time period. The Stoic opposition term came out in the 19th century. But
Right.
the Stoic opposition as a group, right, they were particularly against Nero and Domitian, who were Roman emperors. And Nero is, usually people talk about Nero because Rome burns and Nero fiddles. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's like very much an autocrat with ultimate power, right? But the Stoics, I think, it's calm, it's commonly said, right, that the Stoics would always have stood up for stuff like this because when you look at our core values, right, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, right? Temperance, I don't know that really applies in the freedom of speech discussion, but courage and justice absolutely would, right? Because like one of the key things about justice is its benevolence towards others, right, and
Yep.
goodwill and magnanimity towards others, but I think, we've always talked about it as well in this idea of it's like treating others the way you would want to be treated. So if you see that someone is being treated in a way where they are being muffled, they are being muzzled, right? Then you get into this thing where you go, I don't want to be treated like that. I don't think that's right. And I do think that there's a
Exactly.
courage that takes place there, which comes from justice of just saying, this is not the way to treat somebody and we shouldn't be doing that. But it does come with this core understanding of what do we mean by freedom of speech, right? Like you already said it before, like no one should be allowed to call for violence against others. And then some people would say, well, if I want freedom of speech, then I have to be able to, show terrible things to kids or something like that. I'm like, okay, well, that's not the same thing. But those are sort of straw man arguments, right? That fall apart when you really look at it from the perspective of like, no one's wanting to damage anybody. We're just saying that like, hiding the differing points of view of any kind, they sort of remove the quality of truth in that discussion when you're not allowed to bring that forward. I think, but yeah, but the Stoic opposition absolutely is a great thing nowadays, and I think we see that today, right, where you have people that are standing out there, and I think going away from political lines and saying this thing that's happening is not right, and we have to do something about it. I do think like there's an interesting thing about obligation. Like if you're a Stoic, are you obligated to do something here? And I would say, well, we're not like an organization. Like we don't we don't have actions you must take if you choose to call yourself such. We're not like a professional organization in that way. But it's
Right.
definitely there's an obligatory sort of note to a lot of what we're doing. That as members of the hive, which is the polis. Back in the day, it was a polis, right? It was a city state, and now it's the hive is the society in which we're in. Like you have certain responsibilities you must carry out, right? And the key ones here are go always back to the key Stoic tenets, right? And we have to carry those out. So
Yeah. And I mean, I agree that courage, justice, um, I think all of them, wisdom, even
mhm.
temperance, right? Temperance is more about how you conduct your freedoms
Yeah,
or your ability to speak. It's more
yes,
about being civil with one another. But the first
yeah,
three for sure go toward uh, a need in how one Stoic would go about exercising their freedom of speech. Courage is certainly the ability to stand up for it,
yeah,
right? And again, it's easy to agree with popular speech. Certainly, popular speech you agree with. You have to be willing to stick up for the obnoxious speech, right? So there's a lot of laws in Europe that says you can't deny the Holocaust. Well, I mean, obviously that's obnoxious. History is very clear of what happened, that there was a Holocaust and
Yeah.
6 million Jewish people were um, killed ruthlessly. But as soon as you start saying things like you can't say it, um, that's a slippery slope, right? Because then what's next after that? So it's deemed obnoxious. I'm just using that because it's an extreme example. It's deemed obnoxious by almost everybody, right? Except for, well, I don't know. But then the next step is, okay, well, he didn't say that, but he said something else that was close to as obnoxious. And then you wake up one morning and then your speech is so curtailed that um, you let it go, right? Because you essentially lost your focus. So
Yeah.
what I'm saying is it's always better, and there's many quotes. I think there's one from Kennedy that I wish I would remember right now, to let people talk and then let other people answer.
Yes.
Like, you are wrong, and this is the reason why you were wrong. So every time you say that, you're spreading, disinformation or whatever. But when you come after them and say, because you said that, you create a whole conspiracy theory cyclone on the oppression of that is not helpful. And it does, I think, start creating, and I think we already saw it in Europe, where all of a sudden then you move toward where you can't say anything negative about the laws on immigration, because then you're like being a Nazi. It just gets further from it, and it's like, no, actually, why don't you have the ability to make your argument rather than try to quash their ability to even speak their argument?
Yeah.
That shows that your argument is pretty weak in my estimation. So
I
once
would agree.
again, you have to be willing to stick up for both your positions and others.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would discuss it from the point of view of like, if we go all the way back to the beginning, right? The progenitor of Stoicism would be Socrates, is what they would say, right?
The
The Socratic,
Godfather, yep.
yeah, absolutely. So the Godfather essentially, creates this method of being able to say, how do I know whether something's right or not, right? Like, I'm going to come up with a premise, and I'm going to start to look for evidence that both. And the interesting point is, I'm not looking for evidence of my premise being true. I'm looking for evidence in the circumstance, right? I'm looking for evidence that proves it or disproves it or changes it, right? And that's where I think a lot of this freedom of speech basically comes in, and how you can think of it as useful. Like, I've cited this example before, but it's a good one. In the space program, when the Apollo program was kicking off, there was a big accident called Apollo 1 where 3 astronauts died, and then they revamped the program. And one thing they brought in was something called the Change Control Board, the CCB, and we still have
Mm-hmm.
CCBs today in the space program. It's a very common thing. And the CCB is basically, you show up and you say, I have a change to the design I would like to make because of X, Y, and Z. And then everybody in the room is there to agree with you or disagree with you or literally tear it apart. And the goal is not to shred somebody. That's not what we're there to do. What we are there to do is debate the benefits, the drawbacks, the pros and cons of this, so that we get to the right answer, right? And so I would agree with you that what you said, what you used as an example was obnoxious. But at the same time, we gain nothing by shutting it down. We gain more by having the discourse to say, well, you are wrong because, right? Like, it's an interesting, I can't remember if it was George Carlin or something like that, but they're like, you have the right to say whatever you want, but I'm allowed to also tell you when you're totally batshit crazy, right?
Yeah, right. That's right.
And
Yeah.
we need that. We actually need that discussion, right? Like, as human beings, right? If we, going back to the ancient Greeks, which it's just a good example for people who had a limited view of what they could find because they were limited by the technology of their time, like, to come up with the term atom, right? And if we never changed that viewpoint ever, right? Like, we never get nuclear electricity, right? We never get an understanding of how the sun works, right? You get stuck in this mindset of like, once you have an atom, there's nothing else, right? And by somebody asking the question, which at the time, many people discussing atomic theory, they said, no, the atom is it. You can't do anything with the atom. And then all of a sudden, some, I'll say, obnoxious person comes along and says, but I can break it apart and look at all the energy that's created. Now, yes, it's very destructive. I'm not going to get into that part, but ultimately, if people didn't say the other thing, right? If people didn't say the other thing that everyone thought was untrue, right? They would never have changed anything. And I'll say one last obnoxious thing, and I'm using tech because tech is something that I know a lot about in the medical world, right? The person who invented basically the basis for modern sanitary practices, washing your hands, using gloves, using a mask, he was laughed out of his profession. He was a Hungarian man, and I can't remember his name right now, of course, but he was a Hungarian man, and he came up with the idea that doctors were killing their patients essentially because they weren't washing their hands enough, or they were breathing, and you'd have a major surgery, and the surgery would go great, but they would still die, and they're like, "What's going on?" And the doctors he was basically driven out of his profession by his fellow doctors, right? But we know now that he was correct. And if he had never brought that up, like how much longer would we have gone without understanding like microorganisms and their effects? So it's very easy to pull this into the political spectrum of we need different points of view. But I think other people can see this in their day to day. And you and I have talked about this. Applying this kind of practice is a day to day thing, right? We're in a time period right now where there are very acute issues that are huge, right? You've highlighted some of them politically going on. But at the same time, I think you have to bring it. The Stoic opposition brought it into their everyday that they had to discuss these things, that there couldn't be autocratic control of speech and whatnot. And I think that's why I like to cite these examples, because we think of this as something tiny, and you cited it where you go, yeah, fine, whatever, just block that speech or whatever. But it builds up over time, and it becomes something much, much later that we probably didn't want it to be, right? Like no one wants to show terrible things to kids, but letting
that's harmful, right?
That's harmful.
Yeah.
But getting into the point where it's all these things where people are like, wait, that's like some of the book bans. We were talking about this last weekend, I think, or the weekend before, about book bans, right? Some of the thing about book bans, it's like, wait, that's on the list? And then you start to realize that like they've added 5,000 books to the list.
Right.
It's like Clifford the Big Red Dog is on the list. It's right. It's like, what the heck?
Yeah.
It isn't. This is a dumb example, but so yeah.
Well, just like the book ban, the book ban, I think if you remember what we did, we read through some of the books that were banned, and they're like the most significant literary works in history, right?
I know.
Well, the same thing's true of particularly scientists that were restricted, again, by the state. It's always about, or in some cases by the church, which was functionally the state, right? So, and it's particularly science when it comes to space, right? What the sun is, what the moon is. I mean, everything. And how many scientists were not only restricted by the church state, were executed to keep saying it. And then if you look back in history, there's some of the most significant advancements of science that led us to where we are today. And the person who actually had the guts to say it, because it was against the perception of the church's view of the universe, did it at their own peril. So in many ways, keeping the citizens' right to have the ability to express themselves is a lineage that we can't give up. It's not just for today, but it's been hard fought through, particularly in the Western civilization, to get to where we are today. And many people have lost their life for it, whether it's people who marched in Selma, or these ancient scientists we were just referring to, from Galileo to many others, Copernicus, who had not only the intelligence and the foresight to see something others did not, but the courage to say it even though they knew it was going to be consequential to them personally.
Yeah. And when somebody says something like that, right? Like the trick is like, if it's wrong, we should be able to debate it. We should be able to say yes or no. And, the thing about Copernicus is like, because I think you and I would both say people can say whatever they want, but you also can be proven wrong. And one of the reasons why Copernicus saying what he said is very important is because I think he knew people were going to say that he was wrong, but he was kind of putting it out there as like, well, prove me incorrect. Show me how this is bad. And I think it's Seneca who talks about this, where he sort of says, if you find something else that's better, right, go with it. He sort of says that because he's quoting.
He does. It's almost verbatim. Yeah.
That's right. He quotes a lot from Epicureans and some other philosophical colleagues of his that are not in the same school of thought, and he's like, well, if you find something better, then do that. And I think, I think for you and I'd appreciate if you'd correct me on this for sure. But I understand it as you and I both think like talking about this is kind of the important thing, right? Like we're only going to get to the real truth if we talk about it. And I think, that's one of the reasons why we started the podcast, because we weren't sure people were talking about these things. So,
I found a quote. I do not distinguish between you and myself. I am ready to be corrected by you, and if I am wrong, to change my opinion. That was letters to Lucilius,
yeah.
Epistle 95.
Okay.
Right. I don't know if that was the one you were thinking of, but
that was one of the ones I was thinking of. There's another one though where he's talking about Lucilius asks him. I think in the return letter, Lucilius is asking him about, but you pull from like other people, and he kind of goes, well, if they're doing it better than Stoics are, then you should, like, if it is better, then you should do that, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's a really important thing to say there. And Seneca is someone who's a high-ranking official in the Roman government at the time. But I mean, let's hear. I have a quote that I have always tried to remember, which is from Marcus Aurelius. Now, I am quoting it from Pierre Hadot's book, The Inner Citadel. But basically, Marcus is essentially the as the emperor of Rome, he's the most powerful person in sort of the known world at the time, and he thanks people in his life, and he thanks his teacher Claudius Severus, who basically gave Marcus a glimpse of principles of political conduct. And so Marcus writes in Meditations, he basically says, thank you, Claudius, for the fact of having had a representation of a state, in my mind, essentially, in which the laws are equal for all, administered on the basis of equality and freedom of speech, and of a monarchy which respects the freedom of its subjects above all else. So Marcus is writing to Claudius here. It's not specifically for Meditations, I don't think, but he's specifically saying freedom of speech. He's specifically saying that we need, a monarchy that respects the freedom of its subjects, which includes that equality and freedom of speech. So if we were to ask ourselves, like, the most powerful Stoic in all of history, probably, what would he have said about this? This is a man who could literally, like, raise a town flat if he wished with the snap of his fingers, right? And that's his position on that. And you kind of go, so what's better? The person who says, don't say that, cancel them, get them fired, take away their license, whichever, or the one who says, let's have freedom of speech. Let's talk about this stuff and let's have different opinions. I mean, it seems pretty clear.
That was what, for the most part, advances society, right? It was the ability or the willingness, even if you didn't have the right, to stand up and say what you thought, whether it's advancement of science or governance.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't say it's the flip side, but, I don't also want to say that freedom of speech means everything's going to be, like sitting at the, Plato's Academy thinking big thoughts. We have social media tied with freedom of speech, and you get a lot of BS on the airways. That's just patently not true. I don't think that bodes toward not having freedom of speech, obviously. Yeah. But you would hope that in this cacophony of information that's out there, that maybe AI would be something that could help us distinguish fact from fiction, right?
Yeah.
More so than the current algorithms do, right? Where you have to read the little small print that I can't actually see that tells you, like, one commentator said this is completely not true. Like, I would hope that, if it's completely factually inaccurate, that it would just, like, I don't know, turn red or something. And then I could just say, I don't want to read anything red. That's an offshoot of freedom of expression. It doesn't change, at least my position on the ability, especially for the state, to, like China, where they block most of social media. And you get a social, I think it's a social, like, score that and based how good it is, i.e. the good things you say about the Chinese Communist Party, you get loans, you get to get a house and get a mortgage. All this stuff comes with your saying nice things. It's beyond just reducing your ability to speak freely. It is now promoting the state's interest by what you say.
Yeah.
right? And then,
Yeah.
but I do think that the fair point that some people say that is it's not all Shangri-La just because everybody can speak their mind. In fact, there's a lot of obnoxious untruths out there. I would say that's the price you pay, so to speak. But I would also throw in there would be nice to see, AI. I'm sure is going to do a lot of things that aren't helpful, but you would hope that it could do more toward seeing and identifying speech in the form of posts that
Yeah.
are patently untrue, because that is also a problem in our dialogue. It's really hard to distinguish now uh, between what
It
is
is.
fact and fiction.
It is, yeah, but I think it goes back to giving yourself because the only thing we control is what we do, right? And every Stoic would say that, right? So we're in a state where in some ways I think we've lost this ability to kind of think for ourselves in many ways, and that doesn't mean telling everybody else they're sheeple or something like that. That's not what it means. What it means is question things when they come to you. Look at that. Look at the evidence that contradicts it. Look at the evidence that's for it, right? And make an informed decision and then talk about it. Because people are allowed to say whatever they want. That just means, though, that it's on your responsibility to make sure that you do your homework essentially on that. And I think that's really important for us. We've talked recently about education and how, we're teaching people to pass tests and rote memorize things. In reality, what we need people to do is think freely. And part of that is the freedom of speech side of it. And we cannot think freely if we are not given free access to the opinions and data across the spectrum of the world, right? So, I hope that as people listen to this, they think about ways in which they can do better when they're having these discussions to embrace the fact that someone else saying that thing is actually a benefit to them, even if it's 100% the opposite direction of what they believe.
Yeah. And if people have the wisdom to listen to other people and change their perspective based on new facts, that's how it could happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. With the ability of people to say what they want. And governments that want to take that away are taking it away to reduce your freedoms in your own society. And it is, by the people and for the people. So it is incumbent on everybody from any political side to ensure that the other side has that ability maintained.
Yeah. And if someone asks why, it's because we are better off, at least in my opinion, when we have both sides of the aisle as a political statement, but both sides of the dotted line, I think is probably the better way to look at it. But, well, it's been an interesting week. This has been a very interesting discussion. Mick, I think this is one of those ones where you and I would definitely love to hear from the audience, their views or something like that. So, by this time, the website should be up and running. So hopefully everybody who's out there listening, if you'd like to drop us a comment or a like, that would be great. Love to hear from you guys on this topic because, again, it's freedom of speech comes with the ability to say what you think about stuff. And we've always wanted to engage the audience. So, Mick, any closing thoughts for us today?
So, as I do often, I'd plug also essays for those that want to write an essay on this topic or any other ones we've covered. We'd happy to hang it on our Substack and our website. We want this to be a interactive, community, not just two dudes yapping at you. So
yeah, exactly.
That's what we're doing. I mean,
that's what we're doing right now.
But, we want it to be like a community association.
Totally agree. Okay, well, why don't we close it there? So I hope that as we progress into hearing from people on these things, you remember some things that I always say, which is head in the icebox, heart in the oven. But until next time, Mick, thanks for talking to you. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you for listening to the Pup and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pupandporch.com. And you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.